So the British government has been saved, but the British army has not. There's a gap left in the lines by the surrender of the Belgians. This gap is plugged by Montgomery, racing the British 3rd Division into the gap. They were already in the front lines fighting the Germans. They had to drive the Germans back slightly to allow the 3rd Division then to disengage, pull out of the line, hand over their lines to the 4th and 5th Divisions that had been on either flank, and then race to the gap and plug the gap. A superb operation, well fought and well organised to stop the British Expeditionary Force from being trapped. By the 30th of May, the British army had fallen back to Dunkirk. They blew up the bridges around the city and prepared to hold. The Germans found it difficult to break in against a well-dug-in foe determined to hold, showing what could and should have been achieved by the French army at Sedan. By the end of the evacuation, a handful of battalions would hold off 4 German divisions. By the 4th of June, 338,000 men would be evacuated from Dunkirk, including 140,000 French soldiers. Also in Norway, from the 4th to the 7th of June, Narvik in Norway was also evacuated, 24,500 men, as with the disaster in France, clearly there was no point holding on in Norway too. As it was being evacuated, the German fleet, unknown about the British evacuation, decided to sally out to raid the British supply lines supplying Narvik. And so just as British troop ships are trying to get British troops off Narvik, the German fleet had sailed to attack this fleet. It was looking like it could be a massacre. The Germans had sent all they had: 2 battle cruisers, a heavy cruiser, and 4 destroyers. This fleet first came across the British aircraft carrier Glorious in bad weather with no aircraft armed. It was a sitting duck. The Glorious was escorted by 2 aging destroyers. Both the British carrier and the destroyers were sunk, but the British destroyer Acosta had launched a suicidal torpedo attack upon the German heavy warships and managed to torpedo the German battlecruiser Scharnhorst, crippling it. The evacuation had been saved, and King Haakon of Norway, the Norwegian government, and the Norwegian gold reserves were also brought back to the UK. With the German fleet in harbour for repairs, the British aircraft carrier Ark Royal launched a series of port strikes, crippling the German battlecruiser Gneisenau II. The German fleet was now down to just a single heavy cruiser, 2 light cruisers and 4 destroyers operational, which was never going to challenge the Royal Navy for control of the seas. Italy, however, was persuaded to enter the war at this stage for 2 reasons. Firstly, because of the sweeping German gains, but secondly, more persuasively, was the French. The French had launched some desperate overtures to the Italians, offering Italy a long list of French colonies if Italy would stay out of the war. Reynard persuaded Churchill to ask President Roosevelt to ask Mussolini what British and French colonies Italy would want to stay out of the war. Italy refused all offers, thinking it could get more out of a successful war, and it was clear to them that France was beaten, as otherwise why would they offer this long list of colonies? Also, the British, they knew, had lost around 85,000 vehicles and 2,500 artillery pieces at Dunkirk, and Italy really wants Egypt. By the 5th of June, the French had lost 1.2 million men, mostly prisoners of war captured in Belgium. The French now just had 64 poorly equipped and demoralised divisions to fight 104 German divisions who were brimful of confidence. And so case read, the fall of France. Army Group B would break through and push on Rouen, while Army Group A would break through and attack the Maginot Line from behind. Now the French remnants of its army fought hard, supported by a single British division, the 51st Highland, that had been based on the Maginot Line as part of a rotation, and a new British expeditionary force led by Sir Alan Brooke, composed of a single British division with 2 more to follow. The French were desperate for more British troops, but there weren't any more to be sent. Churchill went to meet with Reynard and to ask him what could be done to help with the French resistance. to the Germans. However, as he was returning, his transport aircraft was spotted by German aircraft, but thankfully they failed to shoot down the British war leader. Reynard wanted to fight on to the last. There was a cabinet meeting after Churchill had left, and Reynard was determined that France would fight on. With the front broken and the Germans racing for Paris, he favoured making what he called a Brittany redoubt to hold out in Brittany. If the French forces were beaten in Brittany, then they could evacuate and fight on from Britain and the French colonies in North Africa. General Weygand and Pétain said that France would not forgive him if he didn't surrender, however. On the 10th of June, Italy enters the war. On the 12th of June, Weygand told the French government they had to ask for an armistice. And on the 14th of June, German troops enter Paris. The British were evacuating the last of its army from France. 200,000 men evacuated from Cherbourg and Brest. Reynard sent de Gaulle to London to ask for more British help to continue the fight from the French colonies. Churchill suggests a union between the British and French governments. Britain and France become one country, sharing their empires, with every citizen having dual citizenship, both French and British citizenship. The French government reject the offer. On the 17th of June, Reynard resigns to be replaced by Pétain. On the 18th of June, Pétain ordered French troops to lay down their arms and refused the French fleet, which was the fourth largest in the world, permission to sail to the Americas. The French fleet had wanted to carry on the fight from overseas. Reynard had tried to escape France to act as a figurehead to resistance in the French Empire. Unfortunately, he had a car crash on the way to the port, and when he woke up from the crash, he'd been captured. The French fleet sailed to ports in French North Africa to await their fate. So why had France been lost? Well, firstly, the French commanders were too old. Georges was 64, Gamelin 68, Weygand 73, Pétain 84. The French army was marred in bureaucracy, was too top-heavy and lacking in initiative. They were complacent. Not a single landmine had been laid at Sedan, as such preparations had been overlooked. They ignored the key intelligence reports of the Germans moving through the Ardennes. Their units had too few radios, and state-of-the-art artillery and armour is useless if not deployed. Most of the French equipment is captured intact in Belgium and turns out to be very useful to the Germans later on in the war. But critically, the Gamelin's choice to gamble everything and go with the breeder variant, which was always going to lead to trouble when the Germans didn't launch their main attack through Belgium. But what were the consequences of the surrender of France? Well, Britain had assumed that France would lead the land war. Clearly that's no longer going to be the case. Now the BEF had been the most mechanised in the world, and now it would have to be rebuilt. The men had been saved, the equipment had not. But the British still planned to only have a modest army of 55 divisions. They've decided now to win the war, they'll rely on resistance units in occupied territories, air and sea power to grind down the Germans. The bulk of the French fleet is sent to Mers el Kebir near Oran. Now Admiral Darlan, the commander of the French fleet, had been keen to join the Allies in the Caribbean, but changed his mind when he was made Minister of Marine by Pétain in the Vichy government. On the 2nd of July, Force H of the Royal Navy, led by Vice Admiral Somerville, was sent to deal with this French fleet. He was determined to stop the Germans from taking it in a peace treaty and using it to invade Britain. Hitler had promised he wouldn't take the French fleet, but we all know how valuable Hitler's promises are. Somerville told the French fleet to surrender to the British or be destroyed. Now the French leader on the spot, Admiral Gensol, wanted to join the Allies and fight against the Germans from the French Empire, but he couldn't decide what to do. He didn't have the authority to make this decision, and so he decided to reject the ultimatum. As he rejected the ultimatum, British warships opened fire on their former allies. One French battleship, the Breton, was sunk. Another 4 French battleships were crippled. A few days later, another French battleship, the Reichslau, was crippled at Dakar. The French fleet had been removed, with the loss of 1,300 French sailors. But from now on, Vichy France will be very hostile towards the British for their attack.